Hello everyone, and welcome to This Nintendo Life episode 103. My name is NBZ, and I will be joined by Bally eventually in this podcast. For the first time in the show's history, I'm soloing it on my own. There's no one else around, it's just me. I'm not tricking you, there's no one on Skype in the background or anything. It's literally just me here for the first segment, and the reason for that is that Bally unfortunately had some scheduling issue where he was away on a trip on the weekend of Mario Odyssey's release, and we thought that's probably not good in terms of us talking about the brand new biggest Nintendo game of the season when, you know, he's not around to do that. So instead of pre-recording our What We've Been Playing segment, we decided, hey, how about I just solo this on my own and talk about Mario Odyssey and maybe some other games and stuff. We'll see, because there's a lot to talk about. But in any case, the show is going to continue as usual after this segment, and we will have our emails after the break, where Bally will be joining, and then we'll also have a third segment in which we're going to kind of talk about the state of single-player games, and with the closure of Visceral, and the repercussions that has on the industry, and how Nintendo maybe deals with everything in this modern era of, you know, all these service-based things and that kind of stuff. So it's going to be interesting topics to discuss, interesting things to get into, and you can also, of course, follow along with our recently announced Backlog Club. If you missed the end of last episode where we announced it, we announced that we're going to be playing Final Fantasy VI, which is a game you can play on Super Nintendo Classic. It's available on the Wii Shop channel. Get there before that closes down. Various other places. We'll mention it again at the end, but you can go discuss that in many places. You can send us emails, ThisNintendoLife@gmail.com, or you can go to our Discord chat, which is pinned at the top of our Twitter, and our Twitter is @TNL Podcast. So, all that out of the way, let's talk about some video games, why don't we? Some things I've been playing. Now, here's the thing, guys. I have beaten a lot of games in the last couple of weeks, mainly because there is some stuff I had in the background that I was finishing up, and then, you know, there are some shorter things because of the Super Nintendo Classic. Obviously, a lot of these old games don't take too long, so let me just list down what I've beaten, and I may go more in depth on some of these in the future, but there's a lot to talk about with Mario, so I'm not going to go too crazy. So I finished up Donkey Kong Country, which is a game I do want to talk to Bally about, so maybe I'll talk about that next time, but what I'll say is I really enjoyed it. I thought it was a great fun time, and again, you know, it's one of those things where the era of, you know, save systems and lives, it was something back then that you had to get over by playing the game again and again and banging your head against it, and eventually learning the levels or by heart, should I say. Whereas now we have the luxury of save states, so I was able to, you know, not rush my way through, but like go through that game without too much trouble and enjoy myself. I thought it was very well made, just really surprising in the fact that it controls so well, but I enjoyed that. I also finished up a game called Cosmic Star Heroine, which no one is talking about, and actually what I'm going to do here is I have a Steam code for this game, because I entered a contest and got basically received a copy, and I would like to give that out to someone. So if you would like to play this awesome indie JRPG game, Cosmic Star Heroine, you should email ThisNintendoLife@gmail.com, and we'll give that to someone. It's a Steam code, so it's not on a Nintendo system. Hopefully it comes to Switch in the future, because I think it would be a perfect fit there. But it's really interesting. It's very pixel art style. It's kind of in the mold of a Final Fantasy VI or a Chrono Trigger from the Super Nintendo days, and it has a unique battle system where you're able to essentially you have like a palette of moves, and those moves can be used once, and then if you want to use it again, you have to recharge. But the idea is to kind of build up your moves. You have a style meter, which as that percentage goes up, you gain more power to your moves, and so you're trying to build up this style meter by, you know, saving your more powerful moves for later. There's also like a kind of supercharge thing where every 3 turns or so you'll start glowing like a Super Saiyan essentially, and then you'll do a super powerful hit on that particular turn. So there's a lot of kind of systems to balance here, but it's this really refreshing notion of, hey, these characters aren't in classes, they aren't just learning different spells and stuff, like they are uniquely suited with these different abilities, and you have to figure out the best way to employ those and how people work together, like what attacks kind of sync with each other. And you can also reuse items. So there's a potion that you just have at the beginning of every fight. So instead of like collecting potions and having to micromanage that stuff, you get healed automatically at the end of battles. But in the middle of battles, you can be like, okay, I'm going to use the potion, but I can only use it once this entire fight. So there's stuff like that, which is really interesting, and it speaks to the kind of thing I like out of JRPGs, which is less the micromanaging aspects and much more the let's focus on this battle system and get it right. And that's, I think, why I like Final Fantasy 13 more than a lot of people, is that in that game, it's much more about the individual fight and how well you do and how well you cope with that situation, rather than surviving through an onslaught of enemies, because you get healed at the end of each fight. And that's something that I respect tremendously, because I think it's just it's a real streamlining of the way JRPGs work. And yeah, this game is really cool. It's got a great style to it. The story is pretty neat. It's like very sci-fi inspired, and I would recommend it to people. So if you would like to get the chance to play that game, I have a copy. And so email us again, ThisNintendoLife@gmail.com. So great. I also beat Super Castlevania IV, which is a great Castlevania game. I really enjoyed it. The thing that's interesting about it for me is that when you look at the original Castlevania games, a lot of the bullshit that they pull over on you is to do with your lack of mobility and your lack of kind of options when dealing with certain enemies. So in this game, you now have like the ability to move through the air when you jump. Like, you're not committing to a jump, and it's not kind of sticking you in one situation. You have much more kind of maneuverability about that stuff, so you won't get stuck in really annoying bullshit situations. But you can also whip your whip, should I say, in 8 different directions this time, which has a lot more utility. And it's interesting, though, because it does kind of make some of the enemy placement a bit redundant. In a traditional Castlevania game, you have these segments sometimes when you're kind of going up stairways, and you have to walk up slowly enough so that you don't get hit by, say, the axe guy, like throwing his axe down at you and being hit on the way up. Like, there's these moments in Castlevania 1 where you'll just get stuck on a staircase and just keep getting hit by people because you're not being careful enough. Like, you should be shuffling up and down the staircase. But now you have the ability to whip upwards, and so there are some levels in Super Castlevania 4 where there are enemies above you on a platform and there's a staircase to get up there. But why would you do that? Why would you go up the way that you traditionally did in a Castlevania game when you can just whip up from beneath them and kill them there? I found that just an interesting thing, that sometimes the game design from the old games has been carried over while not considering the fact that, hey, your moveset has completely changed, and so that's no longer a threat anymore, right? So I just thought those kind of segments were funny. Like, it was still fun. I really enjoyed Super Castlevania 4. It's definitely, I think, an easier game than the NES ones, but there's still a lot of tough things in there. Like, they do a cool amount with the kind of backgrounds and the amount of kind of FX, super effects stuff going on. So there's one level in particular where it just slows to a crawl, absolutely just sludge trying to walk through it. But I guess at the time it was all about kind of pushing technology and making things look very cool. So that's what they went with. So yeah, those 3 games I beat. The other game that I really want to talk about, and that obviously everyone has been talking about, is Cuphead. Cuphead, a game that was revealed in 2014 during Microsoft's E3 press conference, and it was on screen for literally about 3 seconds, maybe less, and everyone was like, oh my god, what is that game? Because you look at it, and it's astonishing. Like, it is this classic 1930s kind of Disney-inspired, I can't remember what the other studio, not comic book, cartoon studio that they're inspired by, but Fleischer Studios or something along those lines. But it is very deliberately styled after those kind of classic cartoons in its visuals. And so the quality of the animation, just the incredible care and attention to detail, is something that immediately stands out, and immediately to someone like me. And having played a lot of Mario this last couple of days, and also having played Cuphead, it really stood out to me how much polish does for me personally in a game, and how important it is as an aspect that I find appealing. You know, it's something that it's when I look at a game like PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds, which is getting great acclaim and people are having great time with it, super fun, and I look at that game and I'm like, it's it's janky, like there are no clean edges. Everything has a bit of a roughness to it that I can't jive with. It's partially why I've never been interested in Bethesda's games. I'm talking about like their main kind of Skyrim Fallout studio, is because it's never been something that I have been particularly interested in as a result of that very janky, very broken, glitchy nature to those games. So when you take two games, Cuphead and Mario Odyssey, that come out and are so exceptionally clean and well delivered and don't have any kind of weirdness to speak of, it really tells me that, this is the kind of experience that I personally look for in games, and it's probably why they have stood out to me so much. But Cuphead is not just a good-looking game, because if it was skin deep, then I'm not sure many people would be talking about it. Its action and its platforming and its design are incredibly well done, to the point where there is a hook to this game that really pushes you through, and there's this crazy evolution you go through when fighting bosses. And obviously the structure is it's mainly focused around boss fights. There are some platforming levels which they added in, and I'm actually someone who, at the time when Cuphead was first revealed, was never really that bothered about platforming levels, because I saw this as a boss rush style game, and those have been successful in the past. You take a look at things like Shadow of the Colossus, things like Titan Souls is a new game that came out last few years that has done that thing, and even to some degree No More Heroes, which does have mobs of enemies, but that original game and even the second one is very boss battle focused. So Cuphead being a boss battle focused game was something that I actually cared about, and I was like, they don't need to add anything to this. But clearly the scope started expanding because everyone was so buzzed about it. And what I'll say about those platforming levels is that they are actually better than I expected them to be. Most of the time there's an interesting mechanic or level gimmick they throw in there to keep it fresh, so it's not just kind of left, right, running and gunning, because honestly the first level I think is probably the weakest out of all of them. It's just a forest where you're just beating enemies and just going left to right. There's not much to it aside from like simple platforming stuff, but they really do amp things up, and by the end there are some very creative things going on with those platforming levels, and there are not very many of them. There are 3 worlds in the game, and there are 2 platforming levels per world, so that's 6 total. So really a small chunk, because the majority of the game is focused on the spectacular, absolutely jaw-dropping boss fights. And it's not just that they look fantastic, it's the surprise that happens every time they go through a different phase. And something clever that Cuphead does is it shows you the progress you've made on the boss after you die, and there are these little checkmark flags that you go past, and every checkmark flag basically signals a change in form or a change in phase, where the boss transforms and does a different set of attacks, like goes at you in a different way, and you have to adapt and learn those as you progress. And it's very clever because it keeps you hooked, right? And that's what I was starting to say before I kind of went into talking about the platforming levels, is a game like this is only so good as it's able to keep you engaged, because it is hard, right? It's a tough game. I wouldn't say it's impossibly hard, because it's the kind of game that you learn as you go and you figure it out, and eventually it's a challenge that you overcome by repeated learning and just going and bashing your head against it. And bashing your head's probably a bad term, because it's really enjoyable to figure out the different things that are going on in all these fights. And so that kind of portrayal after you have died keeps the carrot on the end of the stick. It's like, oh, I got to that phase, I can get there again and see next time. And so I had examples, and if you go back and watch some streams I did of Cuphead, of the beginning of a boss fight just being completely overwhelmed and not knowing anything what to do, just being destroyed like within 3 seconds, losing all my lives and dying, to completely not getting hit once until right at the very end when you're at the final stage. Like, it's this crazy evolution that the toughest boss fights I found took maybe an hour total, from learning about it to figuring out what the best options were for my guns to deal with it, to getting to individual stages, to figuring out what my best approach was for those individual stages, and to finally killing and felling the boss. And in the past, I've talked about like the frustration with some of these kind of old school design games where you go through a level and you get to the boss, and by the time you got to the boss, like especially it's interesting. I played Castlevania recently because this is all that series was really bad about it, was getting to the end of a level and being destroyed by a boss and having to go through the entire level again if you'd lost all your lives, which is just the kind of punishment that I don't appreciate, because a lot of that early stuff in those Castlevania games is not tough to get through, like especially maybe kind of midway through the game where like you're just kind of being worn down essentially. And the way Cuphead gets around that is that they don't have a whole level before the boss. Like the boss is the level, so the entire kind of process of going through and beating it is just focused on this one element, and you don't have to think about things leading up to it, which is, it's great. And it also allows you to try and be creative with your approach, and the amount of you have like different charms you can equip, and you have different weapons you can use, and sometimes things will work better than others. A lot of the time it tended to be a survival fight rather than a deal damage fight, in the sense that I'm not trying to just pummel them constantly, I'm just trying to not get hit, and eventually they'll go down, right? So there are kind of grades at the end, so if you take longer than you should do, then you're not going to get the highest grade. But honestly, that wasn't something I'm bothered by. I never really care about that sort of stuff. When I played through Bayonetta 2, for example, that kind of ranking, like medal stuff was like, whatever, I'm just here for the spectacle and to enjoy it. And so Cuphead may be similar in that sense, but I just wanted to beat the boss, right? I just wanted to get to the end. And I was figuring out strategies where I was like, okay, in this section, I want to switch to a gun which auto homes in on the boss, because I just want to focus on this platforming element. And while I'm just focused on this platforming element, I'm still doing damage to it, like because I'm holding down the shoot button and it's getting hit. So there is a lot of that going on where you're focused more on the platforming element than actually hitting the boss itself, because sometimes that can kind of be done for you. And then there are kind of the things that I found the hardest about this game were not the running and gunning platforming or the kind of on the ground boss fights where you have the dash and you can jump and you can dodge, but it was the kind of the flight stuff where you're in a ship and you're kind of moving around a whole space, because I've never been good at the kind of R-type like shmup, should I say, style of game. I've never been like good at bullet hell shooters, as it were, and so a lot of those kind of boss fights were the ones that broke me down, and like, oh my god, I'm really like, I need to kind of learn to be good at this genre as well as deal with this really hard boss fight, because I'm someone who's much better at platforming stuff than the shmup stuff. So those were the ones that really presented me with the challenge, but beating them is so incredibly satisfying. It's something that I was just like going against this one boss for such a long time, and the feeling you have that your heart just pounding out your chest when you finally get to the end it's incredible. It's an absolutely masterful game. Doesn't overstay its welcome. It took me around 10 hours to finish. Like, obviously I'd love more, but boy, the amount of work that went into this game is just, it's astonishing. It really is. And it's up there with my favorite games of the year. It's absolutely fantastic. Do not sleep on Cuphead. And hopefully it can come to Switch, because I believe they were not funded by Microsoft. I believe they are still self-published on Xbox, and they're on Steam as well. So if it comes to Switch, guys, you gotta play this. It's an awesome game. So with that said, let's get to Super Mario Odyssey, because that is the game that I've been dumping my life into for the last couple of days. And it came out, and a lot of people have been singing its praises. It's been getting incredible scores, just like Breath of the Wild. It honestly feels like we're back in the N64 days with Ocarina and Mario 64, and these two juggernauts of video games, Zelda and Mario, are just at the top of their game right now. Like, nothing challenges them. They are doing innovative and interesting things, and Super Mario Odyssey is a hell of a game. It's a hell of a game. I have finished the main game. What I'll say is it's actually a lot shorter than I expected it to be. It took me somewhere around the range of 12 to 13 hours. Obviously, Switch's activity log is a train wreck, so I actually don't know what my real hour count is, and I won't know until sometime next week, because we have to wait until the 10-day limit is up. But it definitely it's the kind of game where I would actually recommend you try and not necessarily mainline it, but like hang out in each world for a bit, do as many moons as kind of feels right, and then move on. Because the joy of this game is the constant surprise, the constant delight at seeing new things, the kind of enemies you can capture with your hat, and the just beautiful world that you can explore. Like, all these worlds are drop dead gorgeous. They look fantastic, and I really have to applaud Nintendo for sticking to their 60 frames a second kind of mindset, as they have done with most games on Switch. Obviously Zelda's one exception because it's such a huge open world that it's very difficult for them to maintain that, but Splatoon, ARMS, Mario Kart even, and this, it's great to see them doing that, because the game just feels that much better when it's running at a high frame rate. It's especially for a platformer of Mario's caliber, it lets it stand out a lot. So the fluidity is definitely there. So I think that the worlds in this game, they are very akin to those in Super Mario 64. There are a lot of nods to Mario 64 in this game. There are a lot of things that feel like they are drawing on that past experience. There's a lot of nostalgia tied up in this game generally, like loads of references hidden around everywhere, not least of all the kind of 2D sections that you go and do, which have been really cool, and I've enjoyed them. But the general layout and the structure of the game is such that the worlds you're exploring are not as large as I maybe expected them to be, but they're so much denser than you could really imagine. Like the fact that there are, let's say 70 moons in the Desert Kingdom, Tostarena, and that's one of the larger ones actually, is kind of crazy because it's not enormous. And there's like, let's say, I'm trying not to spoil anything, but like the Luncheon Kingdom, which one that people have seen with the forks and stuff and the food and stuff going around there, it's not massive. It's the kind of place where you can explore around it and get to know it pretty intimately, quite easily. And that is something that I thought would be expanded on. I thought from the trailers we had seen like we'd get much larger worlds than Mario 64 because there are so many moons you have to get, right? So it only makes sense that you would have to spend, or there would have to be more surface area in order to hide all those. But there are moments like this moment that I had in the Desert Kingdom where I get 3 moons back to back in this very short space, like this very tiny condensed area, but there are all these different little things that are popping up. And so I think that's the thing that stuck out to me most was, okay, so this game is definitely about collecting things, but it's also about really being, using your senses to try and figure out the kind of density that's going on here, because stuff is hidden in plain sight a lot of the time, and you have to like go through a lot of different it's a weird thing to compare it to, but I think Danielle Riendeau of Waypoint made this article recently when they were previewing Odyssey about how it's kind of like a point-and-click adventure game, and I feel that to a lot of a great degree, I should say. There are certain moments where you're just like, there's some very weird kind of puzzle going on here. One in particular that kind of drove me insane, I thought was just bad, but there has been a lot of that stuff going wrong, and I don't know how I feel about it, honestly. Like, there's less platforming for sure. It's far more about exploring and discovering and little mini puzzles here and there and seeing how things interact and honestly how things react, because Mario Odyssey is an incredibly reactive world. Like, there are these little light bulbs in the first area you're dumped into, and you can throw your hat at them and they'll turn on. And you're like, oh, that's cool. Like, I wonder what will happen if I go around and turn all them on. And unfortunately you don't really get anything apart from a little like whoopee like kind of noise and some mini fireworks almost, but there is always something to throw your hat at or to jump at or to interact with, and the world says yes to that. It always says yes. It always says, oh, there are this pile of cardboard boxes, what if I ground pound them? Oh, they're all going to flatten in this perfect way and it's going to feel great and it's going to look great. Oh, here's this man in New Donk City who's just minding his own business. I'm going to jump on his head, and you just bounce on his head. I use the word tangibility a lot, but I think this game takes it to that kind of similar level as Breath of the Wild, where it's not just tangible, like it feels malleable, and it's not to the extent that you're like changing and moving things that much, but there's an even deeper sense of that, I think, in in Odyssey, and it just feels great, because a lot of the times in games I find things that break immersion, right? Like, say, for example, Horizon Zero Dawn, which is a game I played earlier this year, and I wasn't an enormous fan of it, I enjoyed it, but games like that where there are, there's these giant mountains to climb, and in Breath of the Wild, yeah, you can clamber on anything and climb up it. And in Horizon, you're kind of like jankily maybe getting up there, and there's clearly areas that you just can't interact with, but it looks like you can interact with. This is actually a big problem with the Uncharted series as well. I think a lot of people will agree with me. Is like, sometimes you're trying to climb on something, and Nathan Drake does that like little shimmy animation with his arms going up in the air, and he doesn't cling on to anything. And every time that happens, it feels bad. Like, it's this weird disconnect that takes me out of the experience. And that never happens in Mario Odyssey. You will always have something that will react to the input you give it. And that is astonishing, honestly. In a game of this scope and size, to have that clean polish is just honestly astonishing. It's fantastic. So that's been something that has felt really good. And the other thing that feels really good is the way Mario moves, right? Because over the years, his moveset has expanded. I think Mario 64 was kind of the template for this, where you have the long jump, you have the crouch jump, which like does a big kind of backflip. You have the ability to wall jump. There's a lot of movement options that people use to speedrun and break that game to all hell, obviously. But you move on to Sunshine, and that is expanded even further by having Flood and having the ability to like spin and jump and do all these other things. And Odyssey feels like the culmination of that, because not only do you have all the classic moves from Mario's arsenal, but you now have this cap, which adds a whole nother dimension where you can throw it out on the ground and run towards it, and it will flip you up in the air. You can long jump and throw it out, and then long jump onto the hat, and then go even further, and then long jump again in midair. Like, there are these crazy platforming segments that you can string together. And there are definitely moments where it's like, the game probably intends me to do it this way. I can just jump and use my platforming skills to get around it in a more creative fashion. And that's something that I think defined a lot of why people liked Mario 64 and Sunshine, is there's this real sense of kind of personal creativity when it comes to moving your character around, and what moves do you like, and how do you want to get up to this certain point. Like, are you someone who does the kind of run forward and then flip backwards move, the kind of side jump? Are you someone who just crawl jumps, like basically goes into the kind of crawl state and does the backflip, as I said? So there's that variety there. And they also have the roll, so Mario can like roll into a ball like Sonic, which is really weird. There's like the ground pound, where you can ground pound and then jump after ground pounding to get a boost. It's kind of crazy the number of options you have here. And obviously, as individual players, people are going to crutch on different things that feel the best to them. But I really found that the cap was an incredible addition to his options, and really helped get out of sticky situations. And it's funny that I say the game is less about platforming, because in some ways it's more about platforming than ever, in the sense that trying to get to certain areas can sometimes be a challenge unto itself. There's this one area I think of in the Wooded Kingdom where you have to get up to this high area, and you can see underneath that there's this little slotted hole that you can probably jump into, but it's on the side of the building on outside. And I jump out, flick my cap into the hole, dive after the cap, and jump into it. Like, that's the sort of thing where I originally in a Mario game I'd be putting myself in danger. There'd be no way to get out of that situation, but the cap allows you to do that, to get into these crazy places, and that has been really fun. It's been really fun to mess around with that. A big deal about Mario Odyssey is that there are no lives anymore. A huge deal, honestly, because that really just gets rid of the friction that 3D Mario games had sometimes, and it was really pointless friction, honestly, where even in Galaxy there would be levels where you would be bashing your head against it and having to play it again and again, and game overing wouldn't necessarily do anything other than waste your time. It would just throw you back to the menu, and you could then have to go back in, talk to Rosalina, find the place you wanted to, go there again, and you're basically back where you would have started anyway. So the no lives thing is cool, and I like the fact that they just take 10 coins away from you, because it makes coins matter much more in this game. You can spend them on outfits, on additional moons if you want to, on things to decorate the Odyssey with. Like, there's there's a lot of cool stuff and a lot of like memorabilia and kind of Nintendo references that are all built into the currency system. And so despite the fact that you will probably have a crap ton of coins by the end of the game, it's nice that they make death actually feel meaningful, even though it's a much more lenient approach than they've had before, because the game is not incredibly hard as far as I've gotten. I have 380 moons maybe at this point, and there are like 900 total, and what I've heard from some people is that the late game stuff has some real tough platforming challenges akin to like a Champion's Road or something from the end of the Galaxy series, and so that's exciting, but it's generally not a super difficult game, and that's just even less friction having no lives, being able to take on these platforming challenges and not having to worry that much about them is great. It's definitely less of a focus for the main storyline, and there's stuff in there that gets interesting, but it's never too taxing. There's maybe some segments that I'm like, I wish they didn't do that. Like there are these nuts that you carry around to make plants, and sometimes it's like a giant beanstalk, and if you ride it up into the sky, you'll get a bonus level. If you die on that bonus level, you have to go get the nut again, put it in, and climb back up. So there are moments here and there where they haven't necessarily tightened it up as much as they could have, but it's generally a much better experience, I think, is my take on that whole situation. But Mario Odyssey is really a game about the little details, right? I tweeted out a picture when I first got the game about Mario had just run into a cactus, and the cactus, it does damage to you, and in any game you'd expect that. But Mario Odyssey goes one step further, because you zoom in on Mario's nose, and he has these 3 little cactus thorns poking out of his nose. And that's the kind of thing that makes this game stand apart from other games, is that care and attention. Like, if Mario runs in a bit of soot, he starts getting all, dirty, and he has to, rub it off himself. In a snowy area, the snow will attach itself to his clothing. Obviously, water effects are going to happen, and he's going to have to dry off in the sun after he has been swimming for a little while. But there's this constant little kind of breadcrumbing of tiny little details, down to every time Mario sits idle, he goes to sleep. But if he's next to a bird in a kingdom, the bird will flutter over and just sit on his nose, and just be there peacefully. It's just, there is an astonishing amount of tiny little things that other developers would see as, that's way too time consuming, why would we even do that? That's not going to help the game experience whatsoever, or it might do, but boy, that's a lot of work to do that. And Nintendo are like, no, we're going to do it. No, we're going to do all these things. We're going to put in these extra tiny little things that make the game feel that much more fun and joyous and special. And that's one of the things that defined Breath of the Wild, was moments like that. And Mario Odyssey just has those in abundance. And I think it even stands out in the HD Rumble, because there are certain things. There's one thing in particular that I'm not going to spoil, but it's a thing that happens with HD Rumble, and I was like, holy fucking shit, this is incredible. Like, wow, the feeling I'm getting mixed with the sound they are putting out of the speaker is ridiculous. How did they do that? Like, it feels like the thing in real life, and I'm like, what? Like, There are things in this game that definitely kind of defy expectation when it comes to that stuff. And even things that people have shown so far in the trailers, stuff like the scooter in New Donk City. When you boot that thing up and you start riding it around, accelerating, you feel the rev of the engine in your Joy-Con. It's definitely something that just, again, keeps adding to that feel of the world being just so interactive and joyous. And as people have probably said, like, there's a lot of motion control stuff going on in this game, which I have not really interacted with that much. I mainly played with the Joy-Cons in the grip. Don't have a Pro Controller still, so that wasn't an option for me. And it's fine. I think it works. I've not got a problem with the Joy-Cons in the grip. It works perfectly great. But it's definitely, to get that feel of the Rumble, you definitely want to be using the Joy-Cons in some form, whether it's attached to the screen or whether it's in the grip or even freehanding them. I don't know how good the HD Rumble is on the Pro Controller. I imagine it's somewhat the same. But yeah, that's something that I just wanted to point out, was man, that stuff is really good and makes a difference, I think, in a way that I think Golf Story was the thing that converted me to HD Rumble. Mario Odyssey is the one that confirms it, which is like, okay, yeah, this is a good thing. I like this. They should do more with this technology because it's very cool. So then let's maybe talk about how the game looks, because I feel like there are some things the game does exceptionally well in terms of its visuals and some things where it's a little lackluster on. When I first stepped into kind of the wooded area, the ground textures are very rough. I think Devin mentioned that on the show last time, that those don't look great, but aside from that, like, the rest of the game looks pretty stunning, and honestly it's not my concern. It's more to do with how well the game runs, and it runs flawlessly. And I think partially that's down to the fact that they are doing dynamic resolution scaling. You can definitely see it because I turned the camera speed up to high because it's set on low for some reason. I don't know why, but I put the camera speed up to high. That's how I like it. And so when I'm swinging the camera around, sometimes you definitely notice the blurriness going on, because they are lowering that resolution to keep the 60 frames per second. I think they did this with Splatoon as well. And it's a smart thing. It's a thing that I think more developers should be doing, is dynamically scaling your resolutions in order to meet the frame rate so that there's no kind of jankiness going on, and you don't get that kind of motion sickness feeling from bad frame rates coming in to ruin the experience. So that's been great. Obviously there are rough edges here and there, but for the most part, it's also to do with just the creativity in the character design and the world design that makes those colors pop. But yeah, they've had an approach to art design in Mario games for a while that is very standout, and this game is no exception. It looks incredible. It's really a sight to behold. And the thing which emphasizes that more than anything is that the photo mode is so good. I love the photo mode. Now here's the thing: I'm not someone who generally goes in for that stuff. I have dabbled in the past. Uncharted The Lost Legacy earlier this year was a game where it's like, man, this is gorgeous, it looks great, I really want to take some photos, and I like the way the PS4 handles it. It's very easy to kind of snap them. I think Switch is even easier just because you got the one button, the capture button, and pausing the action at any time, going into photo mode, like rotating around, getting the perfect shot you want. And those filters, like the shadow filter is great, just some really great tools in there in order for you to customize your experience. And I've taken some screenshots of some ridiculous stuff, because there is stuff in this game that you will want to take photos of. Trust me, you will 100% want to have a recollection of the thing that happened. There is a boss fight in this game that when it happened, my jaw literally hit the ground. I was like, are you fucking kidding me? I am actually doing this right now in a Mario game. And I think I spent maybe 5 minutes taking like 10 different photos of it from different angles because it was blowing my mind that much. There is stuff that is memorable in this game that you will want to capture and remember. So the photo mode was a genius inclusion on Nintendo's part. And not only that, just getting out the video capture stuff in time for Odyssey, because there have been multiple points in time where I have wanted to capture a video of a cool thing that just happened, or in some senses an infuriating thing, because there was a purple coin that I couldn't find. I finally found it, and it was bad. It was a bad time, but I got there. So man, this game is just, I think the thing that is the best about Super Mario Odyssey is the new things that get thrown at you that you don't expect. And what I will say is, I think maybe Nintendo went a little overboard in their marketing, showing off the kingdoms. There were surprises for me for sure, but not as many as I maybe hoped in terms of like new areas and stuff. Like there's a good amount of stuff in there, and even in those areas, there's stuff you haven't seen that you're going to want to explore and find. But yeah, I don't know. Maybe they could have held back a little bit. It probably would have behooved me to not watch some of that stuff. But again, if it's the end of a Nintendo Direct and I've watched the whole Nintendo Direct, I'm not just going to stop watching. You know, they've kind of got me hooked in there. So. But it is absolutely a journey of discovery, a journey of just seeing amazing things. And boy, yeah, we're gonna have to do a spoiler cast for this game, because there's just a lot packed in there that is hard to discuss openly, especially when the game has only just come out, and I want to do that. So Bally and I will probably have a formal spoiler cast, so you should look forward to that. A couple of things that I will note that maybe could be better. I think this game needs a map marker, because that was something in Breath of the Wild that I found incredibly useful. And obviously, it is more useful in a game that is completely open world. But even in these spaces, they're large enough to where a marker or a kind of map functionality in general would be useful. Because, especially with my purple coin hunting mission, that would have been alleviated so much more if I could have, marked spots along the way. As it was, I had to bring up an MS Paint document and start crossing things off myself. I was going insane, guys, I'll tell you. It was an experience. So that would be useful, and I think it could be a good addition if they did that. And then the other thing is, talking about the purple coins again, there are ways to find moons if you're kind of at the end of your tether and you're like, I've searched everywhere, I have no idea where this last thing is. You can pay Toad a bunch of coins and he'll reveal a location on your map. But there doesn't seem to be a way to reveal the location of purple coins. And that sucks, because that's a currency that is so tied up in a lot of the cool aesthetic things in this game, like the things you adorn your ship with, the costumes you buy. And so I want to collect all of those as well, but it's a much more kind of laborious task to go and do those. So those are kind of things that I would maybe like to be better. The other thing I would advise is maybe don't try and 100% worlds all in one go, because you will get sick of them. I was doing the Wooded Kingdom yesterday, and I was just getting kind of frustrated, just banging my head I need to find everything, need to scour. And that's not a good way to play this game. It really kind of drains some of the joy from it, because you're just seeing the same places repeated and just trying to find every nook and cranny. And going back to that stuff, having been to different places, will benefit you much more. And I think that's why the pacing of the main story works so well, is you never spend too much time in one place. You're always getting to know it, finding moons, getting familiar, and then you're moving on. And the moon stuff that you do has a variety to it. There's definitely some cool objectives here and there. But with 900 moons, you're not going to get unique stuff all the time. And so there are repeated tasks in worlds. There's always a female Goomba who you can go up to and romance with a male Goomba. There's always a Koopa race. There's repeated content in this game that maybe in the late kind of stages made me feel like it was less unique overall. But honestly, there is so much fun and interesting stuff in this game that I can forgive that. And I think it's more kind of the completionist problem than anything else. And maybe I should just play this game in bursts. And I think that's how it will work well, for kind of cleaning up the last stuff. And yeah. So there you go. I talked for way too long about all these games, but I hope you guys enjoyed that, and we will have much more in-depth discussion on Mario Odyssey on the next episode. I just wanted to get some thoughts out here right now, because otherwise you'd have to wait 2 weeks to listen to us talk about the game, and I wasn't about to do that. So anyway, that's going to be us. We'll be back after the quick music break, though, where we will be breaking down some of your emails. So don't go anywhere. We will be right back.
Here we go, off the rails. Don't you know it's time to raise our sails? It's freedom like you never knew. Any bags or a pass? Say the word, I'll be there in a flash. You could say my hat is off to you. Oh, we can zoom all the way to the moon from this great wide wacky world. Jump with me, grab coins with me, oh yeah. It's time to jump up in the air. Jump up, don't be scared. Just jump up and your cares will soar away. And if the dark clouds start to swirl, don't fear, don't shed a tear, 'cause I'll be your one-up girl. So let's all jump up
Hello everyone and welcome back to the show. It is the second segment and that means it's time for your emails. We are running low on emails. This keeps happening. It's a big problem of ours and like we'd really like some more. So I'd like to remind you of the email address, which of course is ThisNintendoLife@gmail.com. That is ThisNintendoLife@gmail.com. And another important point, if you are on our Discord server, which you can find pinned in a tweet at the top of our Twitter account, which is @TNLPodcast, @TNLPodcast, that's how you get into our Discord server. We have a new thread within our Discord server where you can post an email and we will look through them and pick some out and read them out on the show. So it's another easy way if you don't want to get out your email and find out our email address and write it in. You can just be in our Discord server, type it in quickly, and it could be on the show. So those are our two ways of getting a question or an email onto the show. Putting that plug out there. So our first email is from Alex, who's from Houston, Texas. He says, "Dear MBZ and Bally, I'm sorry I didn't get to send in an email for your 100th episode extravaganza. I'm a horrible procrastinator. Like many other people, I started listening because I was a fan of MBZ's Pokemon content, but I stayed because you two are both insightful and hilarious. My favorite memory of the show was the episode you discussed Triforce Heroes, and the musical interlude was the Sonic Heroes theme song with MBZ's monotone voice replacing Sonic with Triforce. Comedy gold. Just really quickly, I want to say thank you for all the amazing content you've produced the past 4 years. Please bring back the Clone Wars series soon, and I hope you keep going for many, many years to come." Okay, now for an actual question. If either of you plan on having kids one day, have you ever thought about how you'll introduce them to gaming? Will you start them off with the classics and guide them chronologically? Will you give them the games you enjoyed as a small child and hope they take after you? Will you just let them mess around with whatever is out at the time? Will you ever let them even touch an iPad, or will you just make it up as you go along? Thanks, Alex.
Thank you very much, Alex, for your belated congratulations about our 100th episode. I think we're going to get back to some of the YouTube stuff eventually. It's been a weird situation where I have not had the opportunity to get my recording stuff in a place consistently, so it's all up and down, unfortunately, right now, but hopefully we'll return to that. And a quick story about the Sonic Triforce Heroes thing. This was a 100% Bally's idea. I thought it was dumb as fuck. I was like, no, Bally, I don't want to do that. That's stupid. And Bally's like, come on, it'll be funny, come on. And I was like, no, I'm not gonna. Why? That's stupid. And I eventually gave in and did it. So I guess Bally was right, because
I mean, it got a decent reaction, I feel, for a silly little idea I had.
It kind of worked in the end. But yeah, that's if you want to blame anyone, blame Bally for being persistent and forcing me to do that. So there you go. So speaking of the getting kids into games, our ever-present hatred of iPads and all that stuff. Do you have any ideas, Bally, about how you would introduce a child to video games? Because I think a lot of people have that notion, and I've seen it, pondered around on the internet. It's like, well, I'm going to start them with Super Mario Brothers, and they cannot move on until they've beaten that, and then Super Mario Brothers 3, and then World, and then we'll go through the entire chronology. How do you feel about that?
It's a really tough question. I know one thing is clear in my mind, and that is your point, Alex, on iPads. I just want them as far from anything gaming related as possible. And
do you own an iPad, by the way?
I don't personally own an iPad, and I must be one of the few people who has never owned one.
Especially as an Apple fanboy, how you don't own an iPad is kind of baffling to me.
Right. I mean, I've got my MacBook and I've got my iPhone. I don't really feel the need. I think there are some good games on iPhones, and we've said this on iPads, I should say, and on iOS in general.
There are maybe 5 total, and I've played 3 of them, so...
Yeah, and I do actually think a lot of board games emulate themselves well on iPads, but that's don't want to get in that kind of worms. We can talk about that another time. Generally, not a good idea for my kids. It's not going to happen. Don't want it. I hear you, MBZ, when you talk about people, and I've seen this online where they're like, I'm going to start you off with the NES, and we're going to jump you straight into The Legend of Zelda. And it's like, that is brutal and not fun, and will turn most kids off pretty damn quick, in my opinion.
And it also is dependent upon your own age, because for us, we wouldn't have started them with that. We would be like, oh, we're going to start with the GameCube, and then we're gonna, that kind of stuff. But
I think it's important that when I have kids, I want to be on top of the gaming trends. I want to still have the current Nintendo system. I want to know what's hot. I want to know what is appealing. And the cool thing about a lot of Nintendo games is that they do appeal to lots of different audiences, young and old. And I think that trying to enjoy a game like Splatoon or Mario Odyssey and Zelda Breath of the Wild, these are fairly family-friendly games that you could reach out and say, son, daughter, we will be playing Splatoon tonight, and they'd be like, oh yeah, sounds good, yeah, that'd be good. And that could be something fun. And if I don't think I'd ever force like classic games down their throat. I would, if they really, really, really like video games and maybe they've run out of current games to play, because we're not going to maybe buy multiple games a month. We might buy one a month, one every 2 months or so. If they're like, oh, Dad, I want to play something else, I could be like, okay, well, try this game from my childhood, The Legend of Zelda Wind Waker or something. And I'd probably give them like the HD remake. It would hopefully live up in a few years' time when I eventually have kids, whenever that will be, if that happens. So I think that it's just about making sure that the games are playable, making sure that I enjoyed them in the first place, but being open-minded that like gaming trends are going to change, and my kids are highly likely to not like a lot of the games I like, especially at this point in time, and just looking out for those Nintendo games and other indie games, and not loads of other games that appeal to a wider audience that they could play with me and they could get interested in. I want to keep an open mind.
What would be your call if, for example, and I know this doesn't happen as much these days, but licensed games are kind of still a thing. Let's say, for example, because this came out on the Switch, say your kid is really into, Pixar animated films, and Cars 3 is a thing that's happening, and there's a Cars 3 game on Switch. Do you, as someone who is knowledgeable about games, unlike, our parents before us, because we're a generation that actually knows what is good and what isn't, do you succumb to the pressure of, this kid is a big fan of this movie, I want them to enjoy that and buy this game, even though in your heart of hearts you know it's probably not a great game?
It's tough. It's really tough. I think to some degree it's just a case of learning the hard way. It's saying, yeah, sure, I'll buy you that game. Let's play it. And then they're like, this isn't a good game. I want to play more Splatoon. And
or maybe, because, at that age you haven't developed, maybe that's just a game that they enjoy anyway, Like it's the kind of thing when you're young, you'll kind of take anything, like you'll eat anything up. And I think we did that a lot when we were younger. We played so much garbage that, exactly. That's the one example I always go to is fucking Tarzan and all this other bollocks. And, with hindsight, we can look back on it. But I think it also is just down to letting them choose what they want to do a lot of the time. And I think it's helpful to guide kids with this kind of stuff, because you can help inform their tastes. You can help get them into certain things, especially if you're into them, then it helps a whole lot. If you have that passion, then that will hopefully trickle down some. And I can say that, for example, with music, right? Every time we used to, we still do, drive down to London, my dad would put on whatever music that he's into, because he's driving, he wants that on the radio or whatever, on the CD player, and we would always play Mike Oldfield's Tubular Bells, which is a fantastic record that is all instrumental. It's one of my favorite records of all time, and through that indoctrination of me having to listen to that all the time on car trips, I'm now an enormous fan of that stuff, and I don't think I would have been had it not been for that influence, right? So I think that there is obviously a role to play there. And I do have kind of similar music taste to what my dad liked when he was younger. So there's definitely, in terms of media and crossover, you can definitely make sure that your kids are into stuff that you like, But sometimes they're just going to go off and do their own thing, especially if their friend group is all talking about the latest, Skylanders or whatever. That can happen. That will influence them because obviously it happened to us. Look at Pokemon, for example, like how much of a phenomenon it was, and it was all down to the kids themselves getting into it and the anime and all that stuff. So it's definitely it's a fine balance, and I think you have to take somewhat of a hands-off approach, and I think that's probably what I would do is enjoy what you enjoy, but also I want to try and feed things in here. And honestly, I think it would maybe kind of change the way I think about games and play games, in terms of right now I couldn't give less of a shit about that new Yoshi and that new Kirby game coming out on Switch. But if I had a kid who I was able to play co-op with, and those games are so inviting, they're so colorful, they're really just fun times, I would be way more likely to buy, say, those day one than I would something else, maybe. And that's weird because it's not necessarily something that I personally am super invested in, but I think as a cooperative or just a shared experience, that's something that I would be interested in.
Yeah, it's interesting, and you make a very good point, MBZ, about as a parent you have a lot of control, especially early on, as to what your kid can see and do, to some degree, because if they're at school or nursery or they see other kids and all the other kids have an iPad and they're like, Dad, I want to play that game on the iPad, and you're like, oh my god, I don't want you to play a game on the iPad. That's a really challenging situation, and it's more about carrot than stick, I think, is a good way of putting it, where you're saying
you should dangle Super Mario Odyssey in front of them and be like,
look at this Splatoon, look at the Mario Odyssey, you don't want to look at the iPad. And it's not like saying you can't have the iPad, it's saying you can have the iPad if you want, but ultimately I know Mario Odyssey is a better game, not that I've played it yet. And,
look at this thing that is way better and way more appealing, as opposed to this thing, which is a shallow, not very interesting experience. So yeah, that's definitely
I look
a big
forward
deal.
To the challenge. Bring it on.
Yeah, for sure. It's interesting. It definitely will change a lot of things about how I feel and play games. I think it's just because I just constantly hear people talking about, and I think the one big thing is that shared experience, right? Because as a kid, my parents didn't play games with me ever. My sister would hardly play games with me. It was mainly with my friends that I was playing games. And so to have that ability to share something that you're really passionate about with a child who's just getting into it and is basically a blank slate is great, because you can get them to sit there and watch you play something, and they can be excited and want to play themselves. It's almost indoctrination, but also it's just the natural way of things, right? It's just kids will do things that their parents are maybe into, because that's the guiding force for a lot of that stuff. So
good question though. It made us both think a lot, I think, about how we're going to do this, what's going to happen. But yeah. Anyway, our next email is from Forma, who is from the internet. Hey, MBZ and Bally, the Smash Brothers series has served as a great gateway into many Nintendo series, a famous example being Marth and Roy's inclusion in Melee, serving as an introduction to Fire Emblem for the Western world. Have either of you gotten into a franchise because of a character being in Smash, or have you ever decided to play a character in Smash after the fact because of another game you played? Cheers, Forma.
So I think this is kind of appropriate to us, because when we had Super Smash Bros. Melee on GameCube, I feel like we were familiar...
Came out in 2002?
Yes, probably around that time. I think we were both probably most familiar with kind of the Mario series of characters, and Zelda to some extent. And aside from that, we were kind of blank slates. We had never heard of F-Zero before, for example.
We knew Pokemon, of course, but...
Yeah, Pokemon, obviously.
Pokemon, Mario, Zelda, definitely not much more beyond that, I would say, yeah.
Yeah, and so when you get into deep cuts like the Ice Climbers, of course we have no clue who they are and what they've done before in the past. So I don't know how directly influential the characters were in us choosing games to play. But I think around that era, we both got into certain games that had those characters. So I think for me, the biggest example is playing Metroid Fusion for the first time, and Samus being in that game, and me knowing about Samus and having... I think that the thing that stands out most for me is the music of Super Smash Bros. Melee helped when I was getting into these games, because there was a nice tie to those games. There was something that I could hang on to be like, oh, I recognize this. Like there's something that can lead me into the experience somewhat. And Fusion, I don't know if it has like that many similar themes exactly, but the tone and the way that music is presented is very similar to the way it is presented in the Smash Brothers Metroid stages, for example. And so I think that was probably the first one for me. Do you think F-Zero was for you, Bally?
To some degree, I think I might have bought Maximum Velocity on the Game Boy Advance sort of regardless of anything Smash Brothers related, and it was almost like a later date I realized Captain Falcon was in Melee and was from F-Zero. Like I definitely was far more aware of Captain Falcon, and he plays a much larger role in GX on the GameCube, which I think came out in maybe 2004, so like a little bit after. Whereas I think F-Zero Maximum Velocity was definitely the launch of the Game Boy Advance, I believe, or certainly near it. So
okay,
it's just weird because it's just in and around that era. I think Captain Falcon might be the only character I think that from Melee really sort of triggered me into another game at that point in time, because like you said, we were just kind of I was hugely into Mario Kart, and I knew all of the sort of Mushroom Kingdom characters definitely, but it was Mario Kart, it was Mario Party, it was Smash Brothers, it was a bit of F-Zero, but outside of that, like, there wasn't a whole lot linking Smash Brothers and Melee for me, and like the process of playing Melee was very abstract from our traditional gaming experience at that time, and it wasn't until Brawl where we kind of thought, oh, that's from this game, this is from that game, and we'd played way more games, we'd reached out a lot more. By that stage, you were well into games like Fire Emblem and things. And
yeah, totally.
Like, it was just completely different, like the jump, and we knew all the theme tunes to most of the games in Brawl, and it was just incredible how much our gaming horizons went, like, bigger at that stage. So, yeah, it's really interesting. Yeah,
Melee was definitely an introduction for just loads of different things. Not only the characters, but as we said, the music, the history, like the idea of Mr. Game & Watch. You had what was it called? Game & Watch Gallery on Game Boy, was it?
Game & Watch Gallery on Game Boy, yes. I owned one of them on the original Game Boy Classic, but there was no way in hell I linked to that to Mr. Game & Watch at the time. Yeah,
it's weird because it has the exact same name, but I guess you're just not... We just weren't thinking laterally in those days, really. Like, we saw like Marth and Roy.
We were just like, oh, there's some retro dude from the past. I don't even know where he's from. Who cares? Whatever, let's play as him. He's funny. He's 2D, you know. Like, it was that kind of very shallow enjoyment, I guess.
Yeah, it was almost like... I think we came at that game as if it were just any other fighting game where it just had characters in it, and we didn't recognize the relevance or why those characters were there. Like, who were Marth and Roy? Did we even go into that or even think about it too deeply? Or were we just
I think that at some point you had definitely kind of read in magazines or looked up to some degree, and every time I'd sort of say, like, MZ, where are Marth and Roy from? And you're like, oh, they're from this Japanese game, it's called Fire Emblem. And you'd like sort of like you were very into like I've got this knowledge on video games and I'm going to tell you about it, Bally. It's like, and you definitely knew
was that I though? I don't know. I feel like that happened much later, but maybe I was like that back then.
It's kind of might have started around Melee, and you definitely knew a lot more about other characters in that game.
Sure.
On a very rough level, you just knew that it was called Fire Emblem, it was from a Japanese game, and it wasn't in the West. And like,
yeah. I don't think it was until I started listening to podcasts that I became an insane font of knowledge for literally everything. But but yeah, I think back then it was absolutely a bit... I think like I was more interested in maybe the Japanese side of games than you were, so that's probably why. But he also asked if you ever decided to play a character in Smash after the fact because of another game. And with Smash 4, 100% with Shulk. absolutely, I chose playing Shulk because I love Xenoblade so much. That was a conscious decision I made. And I think when we talk about the Smash 4 characters that we play as, I generally feel like they tend to match up with series that we're a big fan of, or at least we want to try and get good. Like, I remember you were like hell-bent on getting good with Olimar because you were so big a fan of Pikmin.
Yeah, no, I went through a phase, especially with Brawl and even into Smash 4, where it was like I can only play characters that I've played their games, and then the ones that I've played their games I'm going to get really good at with. And it was like, why was I like that? That's so strange. Like when you step back and think about it. And yeah, Olimar was just a hopeless case. I cannot get good with that character. I can obviously pull off the occasional win with him every now and then, but like, yeah, it was just, there's something I still quite like, and I can't even say why, that I like about the familiarity of playing like the game that a character's from, in specifically Smash 4, I guess, and then getting really good with that character. It certainly happened with Samus. Like, since I've gotten into Metroid in the time of this podcast. I'd never played a Metroid game before this podcast. And like, I've played 6, 7 now Metroid games and absolutely loved all of them, and now I'm like, yeah, I want to play as Samus all the time, and like in Smash Brothers, and I've really grown with that character, and like, she's a really good character in Smash 4 in my opinion. So
yeah, it's funny actually, because I'm someone who is a big fan of Metroid, but I think Samus in Melee and even like up to Smash Brothers 4 feels more representative of her prime incarnation, just because you're seeing her in 3D and stuff. So maybe that's the reason that you're more magnetized to it, because you're actually a fan of the Metroid Prime series, which, you know, less that I say about that, the better. But it's funny looking back on the Melee roster itself, because having a good look at it now, it's like I've pretty much covered every franchise on here, and I know about all of them, and I'm a big fan of most of them. Like, there are obviously the Ice Climbers is the weird one that's like, yeah, sure, I've played Ice Climbers maybe once on my ambassador program, but it's not a very good game, and it's not something that I'm really clamoring for more of.
And they got cut anyway. Who cares about Ice Climbers?
You're right. I think, although I have a strong suspicion that if they do Smash on Switch, that they will bring Ice Climbers back.
They're going to come back. Yeah.
But like, even down to only just recently did we play Earthbound, and now I have such a greater appreciation to the portrayal of Ness and even Lucas in Smash Brothers because of the references. And the thing that really hits me is like rewatching that Melee character opening, you see Ness like rush out of the warp hole, and you can connect it back to like when you teleport in Earthbound, everyone's like, they go in a circle and then just run off screen and then just run in screen. It's the exact same thing. He just like runs into the screen, and then you have the two guys there, and even the stage, like the on-it stage, is so much more meaningful now that I know everything about that game and what that game is. And even stuff like, you know, Mr. Saturn, just throwing him around as an item is just so funny now that we have that context.
Exactly. So, and when you step back and you think, that was a long time before Earthbound came out in the West at all when like Melee came out, and like...
no, Earthbound had come out in North America.
Oh, right, sorry, right. But hadn't come out in Europe for
no,
some
not
reason.
In Europe,
but,
yeah.
So it was like really bold that just these characters were in there that we just had zero connection to, and then it was like, oh yeah, they're from some Japanese game, like, and it was just, you just kind of went along with it. But you're right, like the process of playing Earthbound and seeing the towns and stuff, like the teleport, like you just said, where he rushes onto the street, and the music cues and the overall music, it's such a nice way of just maybe paving in the, being more gradual about the familiarity, having played Smash Brothers, going into a game that is just so different and wild and like interesting, like Earthbound. Like you're eased into it a bit more, and like I've had that when even playing like a bit of Final Fantasy VI for our backlog club. You know, like just the sounds in it and stuff that are associated with the cloud in Smash Brothers 4 are there, and I'm like, oh yeah, that's a Final Fantasy jingle. Like I know that. Like, and it's even for franchises that are way outside the realms of Nintendo, it's like Smash Brothers has this incredible impact on tying all of games together in a way that's just really unique and pretty special.
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny because you just think about those times when we were debating, is Sheik a boy or girl? Because none of us had played to that point in Ocarina of Time yet. I think one of our friends was someone who had played the most of it, but even he had no idea. And then is Marth a girl or a boy? I don't know. That was a weird thing as well. I didn't know whether Marth was a girl or not, because their voices were quite high, I imagine, because the Japanese actors, I think maybe there's a lot of women who play like boys and stuff in anime and in Japanese media generally. I think that's actually generally across the board, as like women play young boys' voices in voice acting. But Marth had a voice to where we couldn't really tell if it was it was just a weird situation. It's just funny thinking back on that now and now being like, wow, we were idiots, we had no idea what we were talking about. But yeah, I think Smash Brothers Melee will always be a nexus for our point in time where we didn't know anything about games. It's kind of like the BC of our history with video games.
Exactly,
it's ground zero almost of this is where it all began almost. It
really is. Yeah, absolutely. And you're right. We now know and have basically experienced all the games that are in a link to the characters in that roster of Smash Bros. Melee, and now we're just a lot more appreciative, I think, of all the stages and music and characters in that game than we definitely were at the time. Yeah,
absolutely. So there you go.
So that's all we've got time for your emails this week. But again, like I said at the start of the segment, we are running out of emails, so please send them in. The email address is thisnintendolife@gmail.com. That is thisnintendolife@gmail.com. We always need more. And like I said at the top of the segment again, Discord server is a great place to leave an email. It's pinned in a tweet at the top of our Twitter account, which is @TNL Podcast. That's @TNL Podcast. So head on over there, jump in the Discord server and write in the email thread, and we will consider your question. But that is all we've got time for emails. We will see you after the break.
I'm Mr. King Dice. I'm the gamest in the land. I never play nice. I'm the devil's right-hand man. I can't let you pass, 'cause you ain't done everything. Bring me those contracts, come on, bring them to the king. If you haven't finished your class, haven't worked assiduously, no, I cannot let you pass. Don't you mess with me. Don't mess with King Dice. Don't mess with me. Don't mess with King Dice. Don't mess with me.
All right, everyone, welcome back to the third and final segment of the show this week, in which we're going to touch on some recent news, which is relevant to the notion of single-player AAA video games in the current modern era of video games, and basically just have a discussion about it, what it means for games going forward, and whether or not it will affect Nintendo, of course, as we always like to put a Nintendo slant on these topics, because the industry is definitely a good place for discussion, but we've got to have that certain angle. So that's the angle that we're going to be discussing this from. So this news is about EA, who recently shut down yet another studio. I know, what a surprise. EA killing a studio. It's like we're stuck in a time loop, isn't it? Just do it again and again. And they this time have shut down Visceral. Visceral, Bally, are a studio who made a lot of single-player action games in the past. They're very well known for the Dead Space series. They also made Battlefield Hardline, which was a pretty poorly received game that did not do very well at all. But Dead Space is their big thing, their most well-known IP. And so this studio has been shut down. They are also known, and this is why this news is enormous, because they were pegged to do a Star Wars game, and not just any Star Wars game. They were going to do a Star Wars game that was being written by Amy Hennig, that had the full support of EA behind it, that was going to be this big blockbuster title, And now it seems like that's not going to be the case anymore. The game is not necessarily cancelled, but what it was in its former form is going to shift fundamentally. And I thought I would just read the statement that EA put out about this, because it is very telling about the current state of the industry and the way EA thinks about things. So it reads, "Our Visceral Studio has been developing an action-adventure title set in the Star Wars universe. In its current form, it was shaping up to be a story-based linear adventure game. Throughout the development process, we've been testing the game concept with players, listening to the feedback about what and how they want to play, and closely tracking fundamental shifts in the marketplace. It has become clear that to deliver an experience that players will want to come back to and enjoy for a long time to come, we needed to pivot the design. We will maintain the stunning visuals, authenticity in the Star Wars universe, and focus on bringing a Star Wars story to life. Importantly, we are shifting the game to be a broader experience that allows for more variety and player agency, leaning into the capabilities of our Frostbite engine and reimagining the central elements of the game to give players a Star Wars adventure of greater depth and breadth to explore." So, Bally, with all that said, it basically seems like they want a game that isn't going to cost them a ton of money, and they put out once and it's one and done. People buy it for $60 and then they forget about it and move on. They want a Destiny. They want a big game that people will come back to that has multiplayer elements. And I think the most telling thing is the line which says, "closely tracking fundamental shifts in the marketplace," which is basically what's happening right now, is a lot of these games are getting popular. And that seems to be the case here. How do you feel about this, first of all? Because I know you're someone, obviously, who only owns Nintendo consoles. You very likely would never have been able to play this game anyway, unless you went out and played it somewhere else, or got a PS4 somehow. But you're an enormous Star Wars fan as well. So yeah, how do you feel?
I want good Star Wars games to be made. Obviously, I'd prefer for them to be on Nintendo systems, but I accept that at this point in time, the deal is with EA, and that's just part of how life works, I guess. And I'm happy that games like Uncharted exist, and because they are fantastic games from what I know of that series, and they strengthen the industry in a sense of producing quality games of that sort of single player narrative driven format, where very few games do that these days. And I was really annoyed at this news, and I tweeted at the time, I said, video games needs a strong, gritty single player Star Wars game. We can't let capitalism get in the way of some awesome creative projects. And it really feels like this was an awesome creative project, and for reasons of, well, we want to make more money, or who knows, it just feels like the rug's been swept from underneath them. And it's a real shame, because lots of Star Wars fans want a Star Wars narrative-driven single-player game. The Star Wars universe is strong, and you could argue it's a strong universe for numerous formats of video games. Obviously, it could work really well with whatever they go with, but that space where you can have a narrative-driven single-player experience in the Star Wars universe, there's something very, very appealing about that I think got so many people excited. Obviously, with the addition that was written by Amy Hennig, that's huge news. So for that to not be the case anymore is really sad for the industry, and that's coming from not just as a Nintendo fan, but a Star Wars and video game fan.
Yeah, it's kind of shocking that an IP with the power and reach of Star Wars, and yet EA said, no, this game's not going to make us enough money. Isn't that staggering? The fact that they looked at this and they were like, this is the biggest IP in the world. I think it probably is the largest single IP in the world. And
yeah, I think so.
And this one game that hopefully was going to be well made and well produced is not going to do what they need for their checkbooks. It signals me two problems. Number one, the price of creating games and the ballooning budgets has got to a point where to make something of the caliber of a Naughty Dog style single player narrative adventure, man, you have to put a lot of money into that, because the HD assets, even now into 4K, it's just become ridiculous, right? Almost untenable. And so the amount of money you're putting in to create this game is just not going to bring back the results that you want. And the question is like whether that's just an EA problem or whether that's a problem more wide in the industry. How do you feel about that, Bally? Because the thing with Naughty Dog is that they are owned by Sony, and so the reason that they can kind of get away with this, and I think this kind of leads into Nintendo as well, is that they have a platform to sell. They are able to put the money into making these big single player games because it's another exclusive in their belt to push hardware. Is this then a problem just for the third parties, do you think?
Possibly. And like I don't know what other good examples there are out there of like really big projects that have been cancelled so publicly in this way. Like a lot of things that get cancelled, like not much is said about them. This is super high profile, and that's
right.
That almost leads into the question of like part of the life cycle of video games is when they're born, we hear about them really, really early on, and it's a big deal when we hear about them early on. Like we already know Metroid Prime 4 is coming, but we know nothing about that game.
Yeah,
and like,
we saw a logo.
Exactly, and like these EA Star Wars games, like every E3 since they've done that deal, like EA has shown very, very like small amounts of Star Wars games, and like
they've shown practically nothing. Like the thing that the ongoing meme about EA's E3 presentation is they show people in a studio on computers with like graphic meshes and like concept art. It's like, really? Like you have nothing to show on this whatsoever. And understandably, like this is going to be a big game, so it's going to take a long time to make. But if you have nothing to say, then don't say anything. Like EA should probably not do an E3 press conference anymore. I know,
and this announcement shows that they've become a victim of their own problem in that giving these crazy far in advance like announcements of we're working on this single player Star Wars game with Amy Hennig, and it's like, what? Wow. And then like, oh, we're not doing it anymore. Well, why did you even tell us in the first place when you had nothing to show on it, sort of thing? So
it's honestly, it's kind of an investor thing as well. It's
right.
The fact that they had the Star Wars license was an enormous deal for EA, and it was like, okay, we got to tell our investors what we're working on so they have faith in the future of what we're doing. So I think they're kind of a victim of that deal in a sense. But it doesn't help, for sure, the fact that they had to say all of it early. So, yeah, I guess in terms of all this other stuff, like, are you worried that we're now in a place that games like Destiny, where microtransactions are prevalent, where it's a service-based game that people are keeping on coming back to, do you think that's going to become the norm? Because for me personally, and I was kind of talking about this on Twitter, I feel like people only have time for one or two of these types of games. And the types of players who play these games are the types of players who don't really play much else, in the sense that a Destiny person who is hardcore into Destiny puts 1,000 hours into that game in a year, and they don't really play another game. Like, they have that one game. They're mono gamers. And this is a term that I think gets used a lot in the YouTube space, and I, at one point, was kind of that with my Pokemon stuff. But do you think that they're chasing after the wrong thing? Are they barking up the wrong tree here, just trying to go for another one of these?
Yeah, maybe, because it's quite dangerous going for the mono gamer, because it's very hit and miss. If you can make sure that if you become that mono game, you're doing incredibly well. Like look at Splatoon's, like, I guess, a Nintendo example to some degree. Like, there's lots of people who just play Splatoon, maybe, but like the idea that a person only plays one game, if you can make sure that person is playing this multiplayer Star Wars game, whatever it becomes, they've hit it out the park. Like, that will just do incredible things for them monetarily. But if people are like, you know what, no, I've got my multiplayer online games, I'm gonna play a bit of this Star Wars one, but then I'm gonna pass. Like, this isn't gonna be a long-term thing. Then this whole project could completely flop, and I think that could really pave the way for what we see in the future. Where you're right, like, the market is saturated. Like, this can't go on where you just have multiplayer game after multiplayer game coming out, because there's only so many people out there playing these types of games.
Yeah.
Whereas there are plenty of people out there who play all the Uncharteds, and then when they're done with that, they move on to more games. And like, arguably, that in some circles is a far better model when it comes to making some money, because you can guarantee that like the market will adapt your game briefly to play that game, and then they'll move on to other things.
Yeah, it's interesting because in that sense, the person who buys and plays all the Uncharted is probably actually making them less money, in the sense that the money they have to put into making each of those games, the generated revenue they get back from that one player is probably less than a person who plays Destiny for a year and buys all the microtransactions, or someone who plays Overwatch and spends $50 on a ton of loot boxes, right? Like, there are those players out there who, you know, just like in the mobile space, and we're seeing it being applied to AAA games today, is they are taking mobile microtransaction models and applying them to games which already cost $60 out the box. And a lot of people have been disgusted by that, and it's a thing that has become a great deal of debate in the last month or so, the last couple of weeks even, with the release of NBA and Shadow of War, and Star Wars Battlefront 2's beta, just all this stuff coming to a head. It just feels like people are kind of sick of it, but the irony being that the people who shout the loudest about this are the people who know that it's happening. Your average Joe who buys Star Wars Battlefront 2 doesn't know, nor does he care. He just wants to play this game and get a bunch of cool stuff, so maybe he will spend $10 and get some loot boxes, and hopefully he gets a skin that he likes or whatever. That's the ultimate problem, is that the mainstream people are the people buying this stuff, not the people who are shouting from the rooftops about it. And ultimately, as long as those mainstream people just keep doing this because it's what's fed to them, they're gonna keep making games like this, and they're gonna keep making money from them hand over fist. And that's sad to me, incredibly, because it leads to less interesting games, a less kind of diverse industry, and everything funneled into this one business model, which hopefully is going to eventually, change, and something else will come. And I can't remember who said it, but there's a podcast I was listening to, someone was saying that, look, things that were popular at the point in time that they came out were radical changes. You look at something like Grand Theft Auto 3. When that came out, that was an innovation of the highest level. And now open world games are a dime a dozen. The innovators are the ones who set the trends, and then things will start to kind of change from there because everyone starts chasing them. Look at PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds right now and what's happening with that game. So I do think that there's definitely a space for these other games, and I think the industry at large is open to that because we have the independent scene which is able to support it. And we also, as we should probably move on to, have Nintendo, and Nintendo this year have proved that people care about games and playing them disconnected from the internet, as well as, funnily enough, a lot of games that are kind of connected to the internet and are service based in their own way. How do you feel about Nintendo currently, Bally? Because it's an interesting place they're in. They have things like ARMS and Splatoon that are essentially what you could call service-based games, but they don't have loot boxes, they don't ask you to pay for DLC, every update is free, and it's just about keeping the player engaged as opposed to trying to monetize the player.
Yeah, and we know that they do want to monetize next year, but that cost will definitely be lower than what we're talking about with this potential future Star Wars game, or even Destiny, I'm sure, right? So
right,
it's still a lot cheaper, even if Nintendo are going to monetize it a bit. And you're right, Nintendo, when you look at the structure of a game like Mario Odyssey, and you're talking about how much that has changed from, say, Mario 64, in the grand scheme of things, this is still a single player platforming game. That model hasn't changed as to why people like Mario. Yes, Mario Odyssey is vastly different, obviously, and we'll get into that, but ultimately that model is just what Nintendo does. It is to a large degree all about the single player. I know that Mario Kart sells incredibly well, Smash Brothers sells very well, but Mario, Zelda, Metroid, these franchises are very important staples, brands to Nintendo, and they're not going to be changing those brands anytime soon, it feels like, you would think. Now obviously we had DLC elements to Breath of the Wild and obviously Mario Kart in the past, and Nintendo are copying certain models, but the big trend and stuff like loot boxes, the big trend in online multiplayer games, like you were saying with PlayerUnknown Battlegrounds, I don't see those trends Nintendo getting there anytime soon, and do feel very immune in a way, because I think the vast majority of people who are buying Nintendo systems, they don't want to play these like online multiplayer games to that extent. Obviously, they want some Splatoon, they might want some ARMS, they want a bit of Mario Kart, but like that's what Nintendo gamers are often used to. It's those maybe 3-4 games that you play online sometimes, not all the time, and like you're not a mono gamer. So I think that for Nintendo, if you're like with Sony, like if you're the platform provider, you're providing the platform, the idea of having a mono gamer is like the worst possible outcome to some degree, because you want people to buy lots of different games. So
sure,
I can see Nintendo staying well clear for at least a very long time, and that gives me great confidence in someone that owns a Switch, and with loads of great games coming out and more coming out in 2018. Like, let's just let this fad burn up and vanish, because I do think it is a fad, and I think that it will come down pretty violently at some point, and I just don't think that people are willing to pay more money for by and large the same experience, which is what it feels like when you talked about that model of paying, the $60 for your standard box game, and then the DLC and microtransactions on top of that. Like, that is just not sustainable in my mind, even for a mainstream gamer. Like, surely they're going to realize, I'm paying way more money into this, and I'm not gaining anything extra. Like, I'm not sure how sustainable that is.
Yeah, it depends on the person by person basis, right? And I do worry that those types of people exist in much larger quantities than we'd like to imagine. Although for the most part, it's kind of like the mobile market, where you'll have the few whales out there who just spend a crap ton of money and leave everyone else to ignore it, essentially. But I don't know if Nintendo will eventually embrace the loot box idea, or maybe they already have. Like, the thing that I always come back to is
Pokemon cards.
Sure, to some degree. People are making that argument a lot about like loot boxes versus like trading card blind packs and stuff like that,
and the ability to sell them on it and things, right?
Right, yeah. It's weird. But like, take something like Amiibo, which in Zelda, to unlock the special costumes, you have to press that amiibo every day. Like, it's almost like you're getting different loot boxes every day. Granted, you're not paying for them all the time. You upfront paid the cost and got a figure for it, but to some degree they're kind of like leaning into that stuff in a very Nintendo-like fashion. Obviously they're not like extorting people for it, unless your opinion on Amiibo is that they are extortion, which I would be open to the argument that that's true. But do you think that they will maybe try to follow suit and get into this marketplace? Because as we've said, like, it took them time to embrace DLC and season passes, but I'll tell you what, they announced that Zelda season pass, we still have no fucking clue what the single player content is, and other companies get dragged.
People have already paid for it.
Right, but a lot of companies get dragged across the coals for announcing a season pass and not actually telling you what's in it. And they practically haven't told us what's in it, and I haven't bought it, and I don't see any reason to buy it until I actually know what that stuff is, and I'm not going to until I do. So they have embraced some bad parts of the industry. Will they go to this extent, do you think?
It's hard, and I would stick to my previous argument about, like, I don't think it's in Nintendo's interest to create mono gamers, and that they want gamers who are buying multiple games. And yes, there might be a game every now and then where they think that you can have those cash cows that buy tons of microtransactions, like the whales that just like keep its system going. I know that Nintendo might be trying to reach that model, and they've done mobile games like Fire Emblem and stuff, and they've drunk the Kool-Aid to some extent on that. But I can't see them playing too much with that formula of a Nintendo AAA game delving into microtransactions in the way that like we've seen a lot of games doing. And that's because I think Nintendo is very protective of their costs, and ultimately, like, we're already paying a lot more for those I was going to say Wii U. I mean, the Switch AAA games, the jump up from the Wii U is huge, and like that's partly due to the success of the Switch. The failure
also
of the
partly
Wii
due
U.
to economic conditions in the United Kingdom.
Conditions, exactly. So Nintendo first party games are feeling more expensive, and it's like, thank God that's complemented by some fantastic indie games out there that are such an affordable price, like Golf Story and Stardew Valley that we talked about on previous shows. Like, I think Nintendo would be in a really tricky place to sell their model to someone who just didn't buy any non-Nintendo first party games. And I'm sure there are people out there who just only buy the first party games, but like, it's a very unique model that Nintendo have kind of got themselves into. Maybe not entirely on purpose. It might just be the way it's worked out. But they've worked really hard to get those indie developers onto the Switch, and like, it's paying off so far. And that's what makes me most pleased about the Switch, is that like it's just this completely different model that sets itself apart from just, in my opinion, all the awful stuff going on when it comes to microtransactions, online multiplayer games that I'm largely not interested in. And it's a real shame, as I said before, that's like what takes the fall for the rise in multiplayer online games, the Star Wars single player game. I think that is just a real shame to get back to the start.
Yeah, I mean, we do need to talk about indie games a little bit, because they ultimately will fulfill the promise of single player games no matter what happens. I think like there's always going to be a space where a single player experience will exist, because independent developers exist, and because they want to create that style of game, and because it's so hard to create a big online multiplayer thing if you're such a small company. Like, no one's chasing that because it's next to impossible. Like, not only do you need more resources, but you also need a player base which is large enough to sustain that for a long enough time. And aside from the huge corporations out there, like, no other like smaller companies can deal with that stuff, because the drop-off rate is ridiculous. There are some unique situations. Obviously, you have things like Rocket League, which is an independent game that has done incredibly well and still has a very vibrant online community. But again, that's a game that was given away to people for free through PlayStation Plus, and then so they did a good job of like sustaining their audience and keeping them engaged. That's a really
interesting, unique model in and of itself. And like, the Daniel Dwyer documentary where he like he talks to like the developers about what model they went to because they obviously relaunched from, Rocket League is a new game based on the original. Can't even remember the name of the game.
I think it's called like Superpower Acrobatic Battle Cars or something. A ridiculously long
That
game.
was pretty impressive, MBZ. But yeah. So they were intrigued. They were working out what was the best way for this model to work, and then they said like how scary it was to just offer something for free. But then just the number of people that played that game and then bought it later or like paid money later, like it was just unique and incredible.
Yeah, it's interesting. I honestly, I don't have a problem with service-based games fundamentally, because I've enjoyed a lot of them. In the year where Persona 5 came out and where Zelda came out, the game I've played the most is Overwatch, which is ridiculous because I hardly ever stick with multiplayer games whatsoever. I played Overwatch yesterday. Like, it's a game that I have kept coming back to, and I will say it's because of the loot boxes, and it's not because I'm paying for them. It's because they have a system that is tapping into that kind of part of your brain where you're like, okay, I level up and I'll get a new thing, and maybe it'll be a cool thing because the art on some of those skins is fantastic and you want to unlock them and you want to get them. Where there's something like Splatoon, which I've enjoyed and I like playing, it doesn't feel like there's that like carrot at the end of the stick for me to keep going after in Splatoon. Like, sure, I get new weapons, but I'm kind of happy with the weapons I have already. And the fashion style stuff is not like super my jam in that game. Like, it's okay, but the skins in Overwatch are like, oh my god, I love these. They look amazing. Their art team does an incredible job, and yeah, that's the thing that keeps me coming back, which is ridiculous, but it's working, right? Even on someone who acknowledges and knows that loot boxes are a bad thing, it still works on me. And that's the kind of terrifying aspect, is like, because there are people out there who will spend the money, who don't have the self-restraint that I do, who knows how bad it can become. And yeah, that's the big thing, I think, is it's dangerous. So yeah, we're just a very interesting place right now with the industry and where things are going. But ultimately, I think we're going to be fine in terms of single-player games. I don't think we're never going to see third-party big single-player games again, especially because you look at something like Ninja Theory's Hellblade, which came out at a $30 price, was a shorter experience, but had the budget and the production values of a AAA game. Like, you look at Hellblade, and it's gorgeous. Like, it looks fantastic. And that's possible still. It's still possible to not spend stupid amounts of money on a game and make a good return on it, and not have to delve into the microtransactions and not have to do all this horrible other manipulative gambling stuff that has been happening. So there are examples out there, and 2017 most of all has reminded us that Jesus Christ, video games are good, and hopefully they keep being good. So
exactly.
There we go.
Let's focus on the good. But yeah, this was a bit of a focus on the negatives, this segment. But it was
we've got to talk about
doing.
All right, well, I think that's probably going to close things out for the show this week. We have a lot of things that are coming up, including our backlog club. So do not remember. Do not forget, I was going to say, to keep participating in that. We are playing Final Fantasy VI. You can get it on the Super Nintendo Classic, on the Wii Shop channel, PSN. There are places you can find this game, GBA even. So go out there, start playing. You can chat about it with us in our Discord channel, which you can find at the top of our Twitter account. And that Twitter account is at TNL Podcast. You can follow us there, find all the latest breaking everything to do with the podcast. Bally, where can you be found on the internet?
Please find me on Twitter. I am at Ballyman91. That's BALLYMAN91. And as MBZ said, check out the podcast Twitter account at TNL Podcast, and you can get into our Discord server from there. We've got a good chat going on there, so definitely worth checking that out.
Absolutely.
And I should also mention, we are running out of emails, so we would really appreciate you guys to send in some emails, some questions, some thoughts, some comments, some criticisms. We want them. It's thisnintendolife@gmail.com. That is thisnintendolife@gmail.com. Please send them in.
And of course, you can also give us emails on that Discord channel. So please feel free to do that if that is your preferred method. You can find me on Twitter. I'm at Lordnbz, and you can find the show in various different places. We are on iTunes, we're on Stitcher, we're on any podcast app that exists. Just download us on those, and we'll go right to your listening device. Downloaded. It's very convenient, very useful.
And
I like it.
Have you heard the phrase podcatchers?
No, that's a good phrase.
I've heard a few British podcasts. They say they like to plug their podcast. They say on all your podcatchers.
And it's a good what is little that? Phrase. I think it just means any app that can catch so. podcasts, right? Why did the Brits come up with these names? I don't understand. And yeah, anyway. We're weird. We're just strange. We're a strange bunch of people. If you didn't realise that from listening to this show, well, there you go. that's what we are. And anything else, Bally, before we go on this week's show?
I think I need to go play some Final Fantasy VI.
I think you do. I think I need to start that as well. I need to get going on it. So we hope you will join in. We hope it will be a fun discussion. Again, we don't have a deadline on that at the moment. We know everyone's in anticipation of Mario right now. That's probably what's forefront of everyone's mind. But that's going to be that. And until next time, thank you everyone for listening. Until then, we'll see you in a couple of weeks. Goodbye, folks. The musical interludes used in today's episode were Jump Up Superstar from Super Mario Odyssey, copyright Nintendo 2017, and Die House from Cuphead, copyright Studio MDHR 2017. Yeah, great. Let's wait for that to die. Oh my god, someone pick up the fucking phone.